Hello and welcome. We have stumbled upon a very old book, at least over 10 years old, written and published in around 2010 about Chinese movie stars, and we found in it a chapter on Bruce Lee. Chapter 12, Bruce Lee After Bruce Lee, A Life in Conjectures by Brian Hu. And it reads, more has been written about Bruce Lee, Lee Xiaolong, 1940 to 73, than about any other Chinese star in popular culture. He is the subject of biographies, philosophical text, websites, wall calendars, posters, and even folk songs. In film studies, Bruce Lee and his films have been the subject of many excellent studies that typically take as the object of analysis Lee's masculinity and or his Chineseness. And there's a list of people that did those studies. These studies of the Chinese male body have provided valuable insights into issues of Hong Kong identity, diaspora and cultural nationalism as manifested in the 1970s. An alternative approach is proposed by Melanie Morissette, who calls for scholars to pay more attention to Bruce Lee's fight choreography, 2005, 58 to 9, and M.T. Cato, 2007, has more than answered that call. But these existing studies fail to account for Lee's tremendous, malleable, enduring and global star persona as it evolved from Lee's first international appearance in 1971 and beyond his premature death in 1973. This is because scholars and critics have limited their study to the 5 martial arts films Lee made between 1971 and 1973. The Big Boss, low weight, 1971. Fist of Fury, low weight, 1972. The Way of the Dragon, Bruce Lee, 1972. Enter the Dragon, Robert Klaus, 1973. And The Game of Death, Robert Klaus, released 1978. Because of the small number and relative availability of titles on Lee's canon of mature films, his martial arts films are convenient for study. And because the films were produced within a short window of history, his films and performances are easily generalizable. Rarely is anything mentioned of Lee's early career as a child star, except as biographical background. More importantly, little is ever mentioned of the countless Bruce Lee imitators, or clones, who followed after his death, significantly transforming the Lee persona while further commodifying and refining it. The exception is Leon Hunt's valuable Exit the Dragon Into the Shadow, which is to date the best resource on the history of the phenomenon and its many incarnations. 2003, 76 and 98. In this chapter, this author argues that if we are to understand Bruce Lee's star persona, we must consider Bruce Lee not only as an individual who starred in a discrete number of films, but also as a star discourse that lived on, though the actor did not. Bruce Lee, after Bruce Lee, is constructed by an industry seeking to exploit Lee's cinematic persona, and by fans who refuse to let go of the memory of Bruce Lee. In this chapter, the author focuses on the discursive operations of the industry, the scattered heterogeneous film producers who produced internationally distributed Bruce Lee films starring such actors as Bruce Lee, Bruce Lei, Bruce Lai, Jagan Lee, Bruce Leong, Bruce Tai, and others. The impetus of this chapter is the question of why Bruce Lee, once the most empowering of all Chinese screen figures and the world's most idolized star, devolved through the decades into a clown, a shtick figure, a racial epithet hurled against Asian Americans. Surely there are still those who hail Bruce Lee as a cult hero, but there are just as many in Asia and the West alike who view Bruce Lee as a cheap stereotype of Chineseness on a par with other heroes like Charlie Chan. Provocative but idealistic studies such as Vijay Prasad's Bruce Lee and the Anti-Imperialism of Kung Fu, 2003, and M.T. Cato's From Kung Fu to Hip Hop, 2007, and to a lesser extent the studies listed above prefer to conceptualize Bruce Lee and his myth as eternal, frozen in immortality, like the fetishized freeze frame of Lee's character at the close of Fist of Fury. Analysing the Bruceploitation films that were made in the decade after Lee's death allows us to consider how the industry's aggressive appropriation and narrativization of the Lee persona diluted the Lee myth these film scholars hold onto so dearly as inviolable. This reconceptualization of stardom from a discrete person to a discourse spanning multiple human bodies can be better understood as a star function. Celia Lurie has adapted star function from Michael Foucault's notion of the author function in her discussion of stardom as an unownable and thus copyrightable commodity at 1993-58. Here, however, the author wanted to emphasize not ownership but extensibility. In his classic essay, What is an Author?, Foucault, 1977-131, argues that the term author does not refer purely and simply to an actual individual, but rather it simultaneously gives rise to a variety of egos and to a series of subjective positions that individuals of any class may come to occupy. Certain authors of special influence can indeed speak beyond their own text and into future discourse as they are reinterpreted, remobilized, or even negated. For Foucault, such thinkers as Marx and Freud are authors because they are initiators of discursive practices, not simply because they physically penned books which bear their names. Foucault, 1977-132. Thus they remain authors even after they have stopped writing, and indeed after they have passed away. Similarly, certain stars speak from beyond the grave. Elvis Presley lives on and is repurposed and recoded through his impersonators. Tupac Shakur's music is unearthed and remixed posthumously. Actors who appropriate aspects of James Dean and Marilyn Monroe still denote 1950s cool, albeit in new context. In Chinese cinema, a similar case can be made for Ruwan Lingyu, Shou Xuan, 1920-57, Lin Dai, 1934-64, and of course Bruce Lee. For Foucault, the importance of the author is their function in society. For instance, to give a text a legal owner, to justify a text authority, and so forth. An obvious but important function of the film star is branding. A film about Chinese resistance through martial arts to 1930s Japanese imperialism is simply an average martial arts film, but a film about Chinese resistance starring a fast-moving yelping man in a yellow jumpsuit is branded a Bruce Lee martial arts film. These visual and oral qualities, wardrobe, movement, voice, are key cinematic ways in which the star speaks within the star function. Such qualities can be disassociated from the specific human body of Bruce Lee and spoken through his imitators. The artificial creation of a Bruce Lee brand is precisely why fans and critics have used the term Bruceploitation to describe films starring Bruce Lee, Bruce Lee, Dragon Lee, and others explicitly imitating actor Bruce Lee. Qualities deemed specific to Bruce Lee's star persona are estranged from their rightful owner and exploited through wannabes and their makers to ostensibly trick consumers into imagining they are watching a Bruce Lee film. As a result, the subsequent Bruces are frequently labelled Bruce Lee clones, in part fueled by one of the most self-reflexive Bruceploitation films of all, The Clones of Bruce Lee, Joseph Kong-hung, 1977. However, the word clone fails to capture the logic through which Bruce Lee's image has been repurposed cinematically after his death. First, producers did not hide the fact that these were imitators, not the real Bruce Lee. With the exceptions of the Golden Harvest's own Game of Death and Tower of Death, aka Game of Death 2, Ngi Si Yuen, 1981, these films Ng Si Yuen, 1981. These films are advertised with the name of the imitator as lead actor. Furthermore, articles in fan magazines on both sides of the Pacific discussed the impersonators as actors with distinct personalities and abilities. Jin Reed, Deung Ying, 1976, Skura, 1976. In an interview in one such fan magazine, a Bruce lookalike, Alex Kwan, discusses his own distinctiveness. I don't intend to copy Bruce Lee to very fine points, because once I try to do that I look very unnatural. Skura, 1976, colon 41. Many Bruceploitation films even make the story of the Bruce Lee successor their main narrative. The real Bruce Lee, Jim Markovic, 1979, is a biography of Bruce Lee, but also an announcement that of all the Bruce Lee imitators, Dragon Lee is by far the greatest, and as its title suggests, exit the dragon, enter the tiger, aka Bruce Lee, star of all stars. Lee Shou Nan, 1976, is about the death of Bruce Lee and the rise of the student tiger, played by Bruce Lee, destined to replace him. Bruce Lee, destined to replace him. Financial incentive spurs active differentiation between the real Bruce Lee and the greatest of imitators. There is money to be made through activating the Bruce Lee brand to create a new brand that can be further exploited. But even without the industry actively highlighting the imitator as Bruce Lee imitator, viewers would have quickly noticed the double signification of somebody like Dragon Lee. As Jane Gaines has shown in relation to the photographed celebrity lookalike, the cinematic medium is distinct from literature and painting in that the visible celebrity lookalike on film denotes simultaneously the image of a celebrity and the transparent image of an actor pretending to be that celebrity. That the viewer sees both Bruce Lee and Dragon Lee as Bruce Lee is, as Gaines put it, the perversity of the look-alike phenomenon. In other words, a clone is impossible in cinema because the viewer can always see the indexical representation of the imitator. Second, the word clone conceals what the author took to be, or takes to be, the key characteristic of the Bruceploitation industry: differentiating product through differentiating narrative. The goal of these films was not simply to replicate Fist of Fury, The Way of the Dragon and the Big Boss. It was to preserve the Bruce Lee image and make profits by presenting something familiar but new. So instead of the term Bruce Lee clone, the author preferred conjectural Bruce Lee. After his death, the Bruce Lee star persona functioned by becoming flexible and sticky, providing Bruce with new narrative scenarios. Bruceploitation films took Bruce to new location. Fist of Fury took Bruce to Thailand. Way of the Dragon took him to Italy, and Enter the Dragon to a mysterious island. What would be next if Bruce was still alive? How about the streets of Manila? Bruce Lee's Fist of Vengeance, Bill James, 1984, or the exotic Snake Worship Island, Bruce Lee in New Guinea, C.Y. Yang, 1978. The films also endowed Bruce Lee with new villains to fight. How would Bruce Lee fare against deadly animals? Conjectured battle raged against giant gorillas, Bruce Lee the Invincible, Law Kai Shuk, 1978. Deadly Bulls, Challenge of the Tiger, Bruce Lee, 1980, and Vicious Lions, Tower of Death, see figure 12.1. Bruce Lee fights a lion in Tower of Death. The films also pit Bruce against characters from other popular films, part of the industry trend of cross-pollination to reinvigorate existing film franchises. Of the instance, Zatoichi meets the One-Armed Swordsman, Kimiyashi Yasuda, 1971. Bruce and Shaolin Bronzeman, Joseph Kong-hung, 1982, pits Bruce against the Bronzeman made famous in Joseph Kuo Nan-hung's 1976 film. And Jackie vs. Bruce, To the Rescue, Wu Chia-chun, 1982. Bruce is up against a Jackie Chan imitator. Bruce Lee against Superman, C.C. Wu, 1975. Sets Bruce against a clan of caped Chinese superheroes. Godfrey Ho's 1982 film Secret Ninja Roaring Tiger is Bruce battling ninjas. The Clones of Bruce Lee offers the attraction of watching Bruce Lee fight himself, a tradition resurrected later by both Jackie Chan in Twin Dragons, Ringo Lam and Sui Hawk, 1992, and Jet Li in The One, James Wong, 2001. The most audacious example of these tendencies is director Lo Ke's 1977 comedy Dragon Lives Again. In the film's bizarre opening credit sequence, we see against a hellish red background a series of encounters. First, the film presents a James Bond look-alike crossing paths with a feet-shuffling Bruce Lee, played by Bruce Leong. Seconds later, we see Bruce in a different outfit, torn white shirt and black pants, reminiscent of his character in The Big Boss. This time he's fighting a clan of shadow-like demons, dressed in black. In the next setup, we hear Nino Rota's theme from The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola, 1972, as we watch another man wearing a slick scarf, making him The Godfather. Fighting the same clan of demons, Bruce returns in the fourth setup, this time battling a Zatoichi lookalike. Next, Bruce, dressed as a Kato from the Green Hornet, takes on the Man with No Name, or Clint Eastwood, in his Western outfit, as a Morricone-esque spaghetti Western themed plays. Next to take on Bruce, now dressed in Republican era garb as the Fist of Fury, are two popular horror characters, Dracula and the Exorcist. Next, Bruce, now with nunchucks, fights a Chinese wuxia villain in traditional dress. The credits sequence ends with Bruce back in his big boss outfit, fighting the shadowy demons once more. The narrative then begins with the corpse of Bruce Lee, dead after a misadventure, awaiting judgment in the looniest chamber of hell. The opening credit sequence immediately establishes that the spectacle of Dragon Lives Again is the thrill of seeing Bruce in his many incarnations, taking on the entire corpus of 1960s and 1970s action stars. In the rest of the film's wacky 87 minutes, Bruce fights with or against a one-armed swordsman, Kane from Kung Fu, Emmanuel Yang Guifei, the cops from House of 72 Tenants, Chor Wen, 1973, Popeye, played by future Hong Kong star Eric Tsang, and more in addition to the superstars of the opening credit sequence. The film's advertising anticipates the attraction of this extreme rendition of conjectural Bruce. The American posters read 12 underworld assassins trained to find and kill Bruce, accompanied by pictures of 9 of the more Western friendly faces. Similarly, a 2-page spread in the December 1976 issue of Hong Kong fan magazine Cinemat highlights 24 celebrity cameos from lookalike actors. See figure 12.2. It's over the page. The layout of this ad with the Chinese title, Bruce Storms Through the Gates of Hell, invites the viewer to experience a spectacle of Bruce Lee never seen before. The same suave hero, but new villains, new allies, new setting. This narrative and marketing pattern can be seen as the industry's attempt to transform Bruce Lee's star image into a diverse and self-sustaining film genre, much in the way the massive James Bond, Wong Fei-hung and Zatoichi series can be viewed as genres with their own narrative principles and marketing image. Rick Altman, 1988, theorized the pattern of genre development by studios, genreification, from the perspective of marketing and product differentiation. Altman observed that genres are created into cycles, which are then made into new genres through a process of generic hybridization. Comedy spawns romantic comedy, for instance, with cycles publicly displaying their hybridity in advertising for the films. The objective of new cycles is economic. By hybridizing, the studios differentiate their product from the products of other studios working in the same genre. An important corollary of this model is that in striving to create genres, to create cycles, studios strive not for homogeneity but for constant difference from previous films. The Bruce Lee cycle can be seen as a step in the evolution of the transnational martial arts forms. The Kung Fu genre in 1970s parlance, also known as a boxing film, itself was a cycle resurrected from the standard Wuda martial action film. Later in the 1970s, fans could detect aspects of the Kung Fu film as recognisably Bruce Lee elements, whether the film actually starred Bruce Lee or not, just as certain aspects of the Hollywood spy film are recognised as James Bond, whether or not the film includes one of the official Bond actors. In constructing the cycle, the producers and distributors of Bruceploitation reorient the Bruce Lee star function, standardising stock moves, outfits and narratives and redeploying them in fresh configurations. As a cycle in search of a genre, the Bruce Lee film was constantly subject to hybridization, mixing Lee's Jeet Kune Do style with other martial arts film traditions like Jackie Chan's action comedy and the blind warrior trope, as in the 1979 comedy Blind Fist of Bruce. With or without Bruce Lee, the actual person, studios would generify the cycle through hybridization. In fact, without the presence of Lee, who was famously authoritative in producing his own films, this process would be eased. Bruce lookalikes are by definition replaceable, and a pliant, conjectural Bruce can be extended in any number of creative directions. How exactly was this narrative expanded in Bruceploitation? In the language of genre theory, the author argues that these films varied the semantic elements, the easily identifiable building blocks of a genre of the Bruce Lee film, while retaining the basic syntax, the meaningful organisation of those building blocks. Altman, 1984. From Lee's 5 martial arts films, one can identify 3 main synectical functions of the fight. What traditionally structures audiences' responses to Lee's films? Chow, 1981-35. The first synectical functions of fighting is to assert Chinese strength in the face of imperialism or racism. The Big Boss was the Fury Way of the Dragon. The second is to help uncover a mystery, Into the Dragon. The third is to reach the next level, Lee's unfinished Game of Death. We see these basic syntactical operations maintained in Bruceploitation. Examples of the first are those films set in the diaspora. The Big Boss was set in Thailand, and Way of the Dragon in Rome. Bruce Lee's Secret, Chiang Kai and Chin Hua, 1976, retained the basic Chinese versus other syntax, but varies the semantic location. Set in film in San Francisco, similarly Bruce Lee's Fists of Vengeance has Bruce fighting the Japanese and Spanish in the Manila underworld, and Lee Du-yong's Bruce Lee Fights Back from the Grave, 1976, takes Bruce and his cultural nationalism to Los Angeles, where he fights white, black and Mexican villains. The varying locations also reflect the fact that Bruceploitation films were made by production companies from throughout the world. The second syntactical operation is common in an important subgenre of Bruceploitation, the vengeance for Bruce film. These films typically begin with the death of the actor Bruce Lee, complete with footage from Lee's actual funeral. Exit the Dragon, Enter the Tiger construes a scenario in which a tiger must seek revenge for Lee against a cartel of drug traffickers, possibly involved with Betty Chen, a barely veiled reference to actress Betty Ting Pei, in whose apartment Lee died. Tower of Death is about the brother of Billy Lowe, the Bruce Lee character from Game of Death, seeking revenge for the death of Billy Bruce within the underworld of transnational crime. The third syntax strings the semantic element of the fight into a series of challenges of increasing difficulty. In the few scenes shot for Game of Death, we see Bruce Lee ascend the stairs of a building, each floor containing an increasingly powerful enemy. Each enemy has its own attributes. The 3 filmed for Game of Death are Dan Inosanto, a Filipino, Ji Han Jai, a master of the Korean Hapkido, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the popular African-American basketball player. The most obvious examples of the use of the semantic function are the many Game of Death variations that followed Bruce Lee's death. Since Game of Death was an unfinished film, the legend of its existing footage inspired filmmakers to produce entire feature-length narratives around the known scenes. These films sought to thrill audiences by parading the many fight combinations possible within the reach. The next level, syntax. For instance, each floor in the new Game of Death, Lin Bin, 1975, 3 years before Golden Harvest's official Game of Death, pits Bruce against a fighter of a different ethnicity or weapon. The first floor features a Chinese duo, the second floor a Japanese with a samurai sword, the third floor with a Chinese black belt with a staff, the fourth floor a white Chuck Norris lookalike, the fifth floor an exotic Indian mystic with nunchucks, the sixth floor a tall shirtless black man, and the top floor the Big Boss with a big whip. Into the Game of Death, Joseph Velasco, 1981, features a monk, a snake charmer, a nunchaku expert and others on each floor. Tower of Death retains the basic structure but changes the location. Instead of going up a tower, Bruce travels down into the depths of an underground castle where he fights a monk with a long spear, a man in a leopard skin outfit and a pack of fighters wearing futuristic metal coloured jumpsuits. Building on a Vibe magazine article by Jeff Yang, MT Kato provocatively compares Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do with the remix in hip hop, with the famous Game of Death footage being the most vibrant of samples. 2007, 178. To extend hip hop analogy further, the author would describe the refilming of the Game of Death narrative in Bruceploitation not as a remix but as replay, the process by which the hip hop music producers take an old sample and then replays it with new instruments before mixing it into a track. It appears that the central semantic element, the character of Bruce himself, should remain unchanged, yet to differentiate product and produce new action stars, even Bruce was varied from film to film. As long as core Bruce cues were present, some combination of a yellow jumpsuit, a bloody gash across the chest, a helmet-like haircut, the tendency to flick one's nose with the thumb while fighting, the agile use of nunchaku, the ability to shuffle one's feet quickly, the tendency to taste one's blood before finishing off one's enemy, the preference for fighting shirtless, and most importantly, loud yelping. The Bruces were free to assume different personalities and qualities. Some Bruces were even light-hearted. Blind Fist of Bruce, Cambo 1979. Storming Attacks, Yuen Queen 1978. The clones of Bruce Lee even highlights differences between various Bruce Lee lookalike actors after a mad scientist decides to create 3 Bruce Lee clones. Given this scenario, Jane Gaines' comments on the lookalikes' double signification become especially important. Held next to each other, each lookalike differences become even more evident, and a part of the fun of the film is to notice that there is a muscular Bruce, a nimble Bruce, and so forth. Hunt 2003, Color 80. Another important variation on the Bruce Lee persona, one with important ramifications for understanding Lee's masculinity, is that unlike the sexually reserved characters of Bruce Lee's 4 completed martial arts films, Bruceploitation allowed Bruce to be sexually adventurous, even promiscuous. Chris Berry and Mary Farquhar astutely note that as Lee's character progressed, his characters were increasingly allowed to appropriate American codes of masculinity, which might reflect the increasingly transnational nature of Lee's cinema. Berry and Farquhar anticipate the seemingly limitless transnational explosion of Lee's image after his death, and with it the transnationalization of Lee's masculinity. Sounds very repetitive to this article. However, compared to that of Bruce's first 4 martial arts films, the transnationality of Bruceploitation films is even more complex, heterogeneous and slippery, and cannot be explained in terms of the simple fluctuation between American and Chinese masculinity. Therefore, the author states here he did not read the Bruceploitation romances in terms of hybridized cultural codes. Instead, he preferred to interpret them in terms of hybridized romantic genre conventions. Dragon Lives Again appropriates European and Hollywood sexuality from Emmanuel Just Dragon 1974 and James Bond, for instance, while Bruce Lee and I, Lo Ma 1976 appropriates the fleshy lust popular in the subcool pornography genre produced in Hong Kong in the 1970s. Also, many Bruceploitation films, Bruce Lee Against Superman, Exit the Dragon, Into the Tiger, The New Game of Death, appropriate tropes from Taiwan's romantic melodrama genre of the 1970s. Most famously, the Keong Yao films. These tropes include the walk on the beach during sunset, the Mandarin love ballad, and the extended music montage of lovers holding hands as they strolled about the city. Semantic variability and generic hybridization created opportunities for producers to differentiate their products from others within the Bruce Lee cycle, but this cycle never became a genre as is possible in Altman's model. One possibility is that initiating a discourse in the Foucauldian sense is not sufficient in creating a genre. Part of the genius of the system is its ability to maintain order despite the necessary variability. And it goes quite in depth about this Bruce exploitation. Okay, it says here, this tendency towards speculative biopics resulted in multiple contradicting mythologies that may be amusing in its creativity but ultimately make Lee's death spectacularly frivolous. Without a dominant mythologizing presence like Golden Harvest or Bruce Lee himself, the Bruce Lee films that followed Lee's death failed to congeal into a sustainable generic structure. A second possibility for the fizzing out of the cycle was its inability to sustain Bruce Lee's political credibility. Like Wong Fei-hung, James Bond, Zatoichi, and other major film franchises, Bruceploitation films have what TV scholars have called series narratives. In a series, the story concludes at the end of each episode, and the next episode introduces a new independent story. There is little space for character development across episodes. This differs from a serial narrative, where subsequent episodes pick off from the story of the previous episode. Kozlov, as Jeffrey Sconce 2004 has shown, and so forth. more. Bruce Lee's star image lost much of its political narrative coherence as it was subject to revision and competition between film producers in Hong Kong, Taiwan, the United States, South Korea, the Philippines, Italy and elsewhere. Furthermore, the logic of the Bruce Lee lookalike is that Bruce Lee is not a person but a readily assumable attitude and style. If even these C-grade actors could be Bruce Lee, in theory, fan discourse following Lee's in theory, anybody could be Bruce Lee. In fact, this was the attitude taken by much of the fan discourse following Lee's death. Though nobody would claim that Lee could be replaced, articles and advertisements in martial arts magazines suggested that anybody could learn to be Bruce. There were ads for nunchucks, books on Bruce philosophies and training courses. One article in the American magazine Fighting Stars teaches Bruce Lee fighting method, self-defense techniques, with special attention on Lee's distinctive footwork. Lee and Uehara, 1981. And so forth. Another example of the Asian American hijacking of Bruceploitation is Elliot Hong's 1982 comedy They Call Me Bruce, about a Chinese immigrant who is constantly referred to as Bruce, even though he is nothing more than a noodle cook and, more importantly, does not know Kung Fu. Zaniness ensues when the cook is mistaken in a newspaper as Bruce Lee reincarnated and is then unknowingly led on a nationwide drug smuggling operation. The cook learns to use the Bruce stereotype to his advantage, deflecting violent encounters and attracting women in the process. Like so much of Bruceploitation, They Call Me Bruce uses the reach the next level syntax from Game of Death, structuring fights into a string of increasingly important villains to overcome. Now, the Death Tower isn't a metaphysical tournament of fight techniques, but America itself. The film is structured as a road movie, taking Bruce from state to state, fighting in gratuitous stereotypes worthy of Bruceploitation. Italians, Jews, cowboys, Poles and blacks to assert the cook's rightful place in America. His and the film's comedic assumption of the Bruce persona culminates in a grandiose shot of the cook arriving in New York at the heels of the Statue of Liberty. In Hong's hands, the Bruce Lee lookalike is no longer a stooge, but an agent, an impersonator who combats stereotypes by playfully assuming them. Tina Chen has theorized the act of impersonating an Asian American cultural production as a deliberate confounding of both visible difference and visible sameness, an act that is effective in both critiquing the impositions placed upon Asian American subjects via the roles in US imagery that they have been historically asked to perform, and foregrounding the ways in which these very roles might be utilised to disrupt the codes of conduct they ostensibly uphold. Thus we witness another operation of the Bruce Lee star function in Bruceploitation. Deliberate difference here does not simply create marketable differences between products, but foregrounds gaps in epistemology of Asianness in America, as well as gaps within our conception of the Bruce Lee star itself. And there's a lot of notes. Works cited, filmography, all these films that were mentioned. Okay, and carries on. And the next chapter is about Jackie Chan. Okay, so if you enjoyed that chapter on Bruce Lee, the late great Bruce Lee, and all the Bruce exploitation, okay, the clones that came out in these takeoff movies of Bruce Lee, the real Bruce Lee, starring Bruce Lee, or Bruce Lai, Bruce Lowe, Bruce Leong, Bruce Lang, etc., etc., even Dragon Lee, which we reckon he's the best. Yeah, he's a Korean. His eyes are obviously different, right? He's more stockier than Bruce, but yeah, done a hell of a good job. The other one that always wears the glasses is skinny. I think it's Bruce Lee. Yeah, he's pretty good. And the other one, Bruce Leong. Yeah, he's not too bad either. Yeah, most of those are pretty zany, pretty crazy movies, but they're so ridiculous, but they're quite enjoyable to watch. Okay, so if you like this video, subscribe to our channel, give us a thumbs up, give us a like, and add your comments below, and we'll have a look at those as soon as possible and get back to you on those. In regards to this Bruceploitation that went on after Bruce Lee's death, tell us about it. We're interested. Tell us about those kind of movies that you saw, like you had the ones with ninjas, American ninjas, big blue eyes and big blonde mustaches and leaping around, and guys having extra stretchy arms, and then they could just fly through the air, walk on leaves and the tallest trees, all that sort of crap, right? Tell us about it, and then go share this video with all your friends, family, and others that like to laugh at those sometimes fantastic, sometimes far out, stupid, wacky Bruceploitation movies of the 70s.